Hi Steve, thanks for sending me your footage from Knockhill. It's the first time I've seen one of these GoPro 8s in the flesh, as it were. And I have to say the image is outstanding in its quality, really. It really is very good. However, from a study point of view, from my point of view, because I think it's the stability aspect of the camera is so efficient, it takes out a lot of the small nuances which the bike's doing, like the first part of the tip-in and the little alterations that you sometimes do on the bike. That often, if the camera's mounted solid without this stabilization, you kind of see the bike moving around. It's kind of so, I want to use the word dumbed down. From an image point of view, it's very good, but it doesn't sort of help me in lots of places because I can't quite see exactly the aggression you tip in with and the little small changes that happens on the bike. However, I've picked enough out which we can work on. Now I'm guessing that the session I'm looking at here, I think this may have been the first of the two sessions, really busy early on in the session. So I've kind of picked it up around 6 minutes, 16, 18, something like that, coming out of the hairpin. And we're going to basically run around 2 laps. Now this lap that you're on, I've made some notes and there's a couple of mistakes here and there. The second lap, the first part of it's a lot better. And we'll talk about the whys of it as we get round to it. One of the first things I think of, first of all, when I see you riding as a whole, is your braking is probably not your worst thing, but a thing that you can probably improve on the easiest and the most. Your line is generally pretty good. There's not a huge amount I can really squawk about your line. Maybe going into the hairpin, you're sort of middle of the track where we can be maybe slightly more left before you tip in. But it's been a while since I've been there. I know it was bumpy on the brakes there, so it's all about keeping the thing stable. And I'm not 100% certain nowadays where the best place is at Knockhill. If I was there, I'd be able to sort of give you a bit more feedback on that one. However, the line, as I say, is you're generally pretty good on, but there's no way we can actually reduce that in distance point of view. The only thing we can think about the line is the amount of time we spend on the line, trying to reduce the amount of time we spend on it. Now that means because we can't cut corners, we have to either go faster or slow down faster, effectively steepen up the acceleration curve and steepen up the deceleration curve. If you look at it like a sound wave, your speed trace, if it's like a long steady build up, long steady drop offs, it's beautiful and smooth, and your riding it looks really smooth from what I can see, but all that smooth build up and smooth drop off is burning time what you're spending on the line. Where if we can steepen up your acceleration and steepen your deceleration, you're braking into the corners, it will be less smooth, more aggressive, but you spend less time on the line. What you've got to try and think about it really is whatever you're doing on the bike, it wants to be the best which is feasible at that point in time. Now, the strange thing about it is there's an element of that which means going fast around the corners. But the difference, mid-corner speed on the average corner around Knockhill, the difference between the fastest guy and the slowest guy mid-corner isn't a huge amount of difference. That's not where all the big time comes from. The big time comes with the arrival and the depart of the corner. The actual corner speed, if you can bring that up a bit, happy days. But the thing about bringing corner speed up is it brings angular leaning. So that potentially can start to ruin your acceleration out of the corner. So there's a bit of a compromise sometimes depending on the acuteness of the corner or the gradient or inclines or whatever. So sometimes you have to sort of compromise what speed you go around the corner to get the best out of either of the approach or the acceleration. Now, Knockhill has some peculiar oddities. If it was a completely flat circuit, it would be a very different lap time. But because of the undulations and the drop-offs, particularly like going down through Duffus and into McIntyres and the drop down there, you can't really carry as much corner speed as you want to because of all what's going on, you know, the dropping off down the hill at the end of the straight, etc. So again, that's a compromise. And that's one of the things that this camera tends to sort of mask slightly, particularly turn 1, is the approach and the drop into the corner, how kind of aggressive that is. The line looks really good. I'm picking up a lot of what the bike's doing tone wise. Now, unfortunately, Zoom doesn't like to run with conversation and background noise. So when we're going to hear the bike running, I'll have to shut up, which is great. So I'll run the bike so you can hear if I'm trying to get you to listen to a tone of the bike. And then we'll maybe review it again, and then we talk you through it, or whichever way around it comes. Okay, let's get up to the first, over the line, down to the first, down to turn 1. There is stuff to do up here, but we'll get to that on the next lap when we get back there. So again, I tend to go sort of either mid to right here, because again, if you look at an aerial shot of Knockhill, the straight actually isn't straight. It's straight up to the plateau over the start finish line, and at that point it ever so slightly kinks, and then a straight line down to the next down into turn 1. So the ultimate best place to be really on this street view, if you'd be looking at an aerial shot, is more over this side of the track. So you've come from the left hand side of the track down at the hairpin, you cross the finish line here, and you get back over to that side of the track down at turn 1, and that's from a straight line as the crow flies. That's the straightest line you can do. But middle of the track is fine, but appreciate that there is a slight kink as you go over the rise, which you'll start to pick up. Like for instance, if you went over the left-hand side of the track here, you'd have to physically turn right, as you've probably discovered in the past. Right, carrying on the run down to turn 1. Controlling any bike, particularly 1000 at that point, is hard work, but we'll get back to that in a second. Now, the run into turn 1, it's a bit of a scary thing on any bike, but particularly on 1000 when you're doing a shitload of mile an hour at this point. And it's all about getting it controlled, getting it stopped. Now, the chances are you're still almost in a kind of a wheelie state by the time you come into this point, trying to get the thing back under control and get it down. So obviously, get the wheel planted before you start thinking about doing any proper braking. Because the big thing is the weight transition. If the bike, even if the front wheel's on the floor, but you're still driving fairly hard, most of the weight's off the wheel. So if you very rapidly go for a really strong brake, you can actually overcome the amount of grip you've got, and you can induce a kind of a twitch or a slide, which really upsets you in the first part of your braking. So it's definitely the roll and squeeze. So the transition is smooth. But again, I can't go because I can't see the camera being very active. It's kind of like slightly dumbed down the action of everything. Your deceleration here, I'm only going really off the tone of the bike. And it sounds like, from my perspective, you're spending a long time here. For me, too long slowing down. And it's a very progressive slow down, which I think potentially we can keep the throttle on longer and bring it down with more aggressive braking. You know, a roll off and squeeze, and then squeeze the shit out of it, and then trail it off just before you sort of go into the corner. So a much more compacted amount of braking. Now, if you think about it, Knockhill's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, effectively only really 7 corners. Some of those are chicanes, so you know you're looking at sort of 6 opportunities to sort of gain or lose time. So if we can sort of nip maybe 1/10 of a second per corner, straight away you're over half a second faster. So for a lot of riders, say a novice rider, for instance, you're looking for like eureka moments. You know, you're looking at knocking sort of 10 seconds off a lap to get somewhere proper. For someone like yourself, who's kind of starting to get there, you're only starting to, we're really looking at refining people's riding. And we're looking to sort of nibble away at stuff as opposed to take massive lumps. You're not going to drop 2-3 seconds here. It's realistically isn't going to happen. But the better way of doing it from your perspective is chip away at your time and keep your confidence high. One thing you don't want to do is overextend, trying to sort of have this breakthrough moment and then end up scaring yourself, because unfortunately your subconscious, which is doing a lot of the work for you when you're riding the bike, remembers shit like that. So if you sort of get well out of your comfort zone and think, well, there you're coming into a corner and struggle to stop, Your conscious mind soon forgets that and thinks, well, that was all right, and carries on, sort of thing. But your subconscious is still reeling in horror about it. So the next time you go into that same corner, you kind of overcompensate for it, and it takes quite a while to get back again. So it's really, it pays dividends to sort of get going fairly quickly, and then refine and nibble away at it, so you can stay within your comfort zone, so your subconscious doesn't get freaked out by it all. But either way, the breaking into turn one for me is very protracted. It's far too much like a slow. I'm not saying you're just rolling off to the corner. Clearly, you are braking, but I think it can be much more compacted. And even if you'd only shave a couple of tenths of a second off in your braking area, you do that 10 times in a race, and where are you? You know, you're a hell of a lot further up the field than you would have been. And that's just on one particular braking application. So we'll get back to that in again, because we've got a couple of laps to get in, and I'm busy yattering at you. Right, into turn one. Peel off is about right. We're sort of, it's quite difficult sometimes to get right to the end, you know, where the novice cones are. And the faster that you're going, the quicker that you're going to cover that distance. Now, you generally speaking, your line here is kind of a nice steady peel off into the corner sort of thing. And if you kind of leave it too late, it's very desperate to get the thing on its side. So the faster that you're physically traveling forward, the faster that you're covering that ground, the quicker you have to get your tip in matched. Now, this is where your camera, it struggles with it, because you might tip in a little bit faster, but the camera's almost kind of like slightly behind when it's going in. It's like it's almost on a delayed reaction. But generally speaking, your line here is I think fine. Trailing the brake off, and definitely be off brake before you get to the rise point of view. People who hang on to the brake trying to still get it to stop are going to be in trouble here. But you do a great job, you're off the brake, and then you run down the hill, light a tiny bit of throttle, get the transition done, and then sort of as you get down to the bottom of Duffus here, this is Duffus and McTyres, as you go into the Duffus, you get compression, so you get a bit of grip, and you can drive out. You've done a few laps here now. This effectively is a bit like a chicane. If you go super fast round Duffus, you're going to be out of position for McIntyres. If you go slow round Duffus to get a great line into McIntyres, you're going to have a dozen people parking up the inside of you. So there's an element of compromise into this corner. But generally speaking, don't be afraid of using a bit of the track out to at least the middle of the track. Middle to say maybe two-thirds even, but that makes it hard work to get back over to the left, ready for the right. Now, this particular lap, when we go around here, we haven't got sound, but we'll have a little listen from here to the chicane. And this is the bit from McIntyre through the chicane, probably where we can get quite a chunk of time. It's an awkward section, because you've got the drop off into the dip, you've got the transition from right to left, and then back over to right for the chicane. So there's a shitload going on. And you do quite a smooth job of it. And if you listen to the tone of the engine in this particular lap, when you go into the dip, you're a bit on and off the throttle. And it's a little bit sort of like you're not quite sure of your pace. And the one thing about going on and off throttle fairly quickly is you're really screwing up with the bike's geometry, because you're basically going weight on the front wheel, weight on the back wheel, weight on the front wheel, weight on the back wheel, which really upsets the bike. You might not realize it, but it does. So kind of roll back and roll on, as opposed to try to be too abrupt with the throttle. And if you can, going through the dip, just kind of ease back to almost a coast, as opposed to shutting the throttle. Because at big lean going through the dip, if you shut the throttle there, you're putting weight on the front wheel just when you don't want it to. But either way, we'll have a listen to the bike through this particular lap, and then we'll come back to it. So have a listen. Did you hear that going through the dip? And another thing about that was when you went through McIntyre, and there's not a huge amount wrong with your line, when we went into McIntyre here, we weren't that close to the apex. And I think because of that, we got to about this point in the track before you actually picked the throttle up. So like I think you may have been recovering. But you're looking at your other laps there, it's slightly confused early on because there was traffic. But even towards the end of this session, we get 3 reasonable laps. And the next lap going round here, you do a really good job, because at the apex of the corner here, you are, like at the moment, our wheels are probably here in the track. And the next time we come around the corner, your wheels are right on there. Now, you might not think that that makes a bit of a difference, but because McIntyres are so relatively tight, you lose this much on your exit. So if you can get to that point, you effectively open the exit out by that much. So it's particularly important, the more acute the corner, to bag them apexes. I would never run on the curb here. It's just too risky. But be as close to it with your wheels as you can. And if your knee clips the curb, if you have to lift your knee up to get over the curb, that isn't the end of the world. The advantage you're going to get is the drive out. But the main thing, by the time you get to this point, that's all your deceleration gone. From now, it's all about picking the throttle up, even if there's a tiny amount of maintenance throttle before you then start your drive out the corner. But this is the point that you want to get to. Right, round through here. Now this particular lap, you came out of the corner, use the curb by all means, except in the wet, of course. Great job, and that starts to open up a little bit the run to the kink. Now the kink, really you only see the thing properly until you're almost right on it, because it goes over that slight drop. And you think, well, I've not got that far to run here. And if you listen to your engine RPM, it gets to a height here, and there isn't that much of a sort of an increase or a drop off dropping down the hill there. And your deceleration from sort of the bottom of the hill, from sort of, let's just get a little bit closer. From about this point in the track, it's difficult to tell just listening again. If I was behind, you'd have a much more accurate point of view. But it sounds like you do most of your slowing down into the chicane, more or less just by rolling up to it on a closed throttle and perhaps a light squeeze of the brake. Now that's fine, but your deceleration curve is nice and smooth, so you arrive there nice and sort of controlled, and it's all lovely. But you burnt time doing that. So the faster we're traveling at this point, for the longer you can be driving or be on gas, and then you speed that deceleration curve up by brakes. So it means it's much more sort of drive, brake, ease the brake through the chicane, as opposed to roll up, roll off, roll through. Because the time that you're spending on the line doing that roll off, roll up, you're starting to stretch the amount of time you're spending on it. So we've got to try and get you sort of driving, braking, driving, braking. Initially, when you do it, it'll seem very aggressive, and you won't sort of see the point in it. Your times will actually fall away, as opposed to improve. But that's only because you're now riding in the nice smooth way you are riding as fast as you can, but that's only got a certain amount of shelf life. If you want to go faster, you're going to have to do something different, which is getting a little more serious on the brakes. But that on and off the throttle thing has to stop on a regular basis, get much more regimented, to sort of ease back through the dip, and here driving hard towards the chicane. It's always scary going through the chicane, because generally speaking, what we used to do is run straight over the curb. It looks like you're doing that. And the transition from left to right, I can remember on the 600s, for instance, that the front wheels used to be in the air, and you'd almost jumped it through there on a Steely 600. And the payback, or the deficit about going through this chicane super fast, is that it sort of drops onto the straight, as you know, and it's about sort of almost gaining control. It's a bit like you go over the jump almost, and then kind of land. You have to let it all kind of settle and then pick the throttle up. But the thing about going through the chicane quickly, physically going through the chicane quickly, is no matter how much, even if you do lose a tiny bit of time in sorting yourself out the other side, you're already carrying that momentum through there. So it's about carrying momentum onto the straight. And it's a bit of a balancing act between carrying too much speed there and spending too much time sorting it out the other side, and not going fast enough through the chicane, and then having to accelerate onto the straight, and you spend half of the straight getting back to where you kind of were. One of the biggest things in chicanes slows people down is the reluctance to changing direction quickly. So they change direction physically from left to right or right to left, whichever it is, and they change direction at a certain pace. Now, when it comes to timing, if you change direction too slow, you're going to miss the other apex. If you change direction too quickly, you're going to mount the other apex. So changing direction quickly or too quickly, you can view it two ways. The way I view it is if you can physically change direction that fast, but your apex too early to the next side, just try going between the chicane faster, between the two apexes faster, but keep that speed of direction change where it was. So it's a mistake, yes, but it's only a mistake because you're not potentially going fast enough at that point in time. Does that make any sense? The chicane, you can make time up there. You're lovely and smooth there, but you're burning time at the same point. Right, when we come out of the chicane, this is the first time really on this lap that we're going to talk about it. You pick the throttle up, you drive to about there, and then short shift. I can never understand people that hit a short shift, and while the bike's accelerating, let it accelerate. You know, stay in, if it's second gear at that point, stay in second gear a bit longer and drive it out in second gear. The bike will generally accelerate better in the lower gears. You short shift into third, so you drop the engine revs maybe 1,000 RPM down the rev range, and then use kind of the torque a bit. But the bike's really only starting to wake up, and then you're getting into the area where you're sort of rolling off with the brakes into Clark. So again, that acceleration curve is kind of slightly flattened out because I'm not saying you're wasting time changing gear, but you're dumbing down the bike's potential acceleration. Obviously, the bike's going to, the more power you're putting on at this point in time in a lower gear, you're going to start to make the tyre work harder. But I'm guessing, you know, that you're riding a modern Suzuki with traction and stuff like that. And if that's the case, let the traction do the work for you, sort of thing. Get used to the idea and dial in or dial out traction to help make the bike move forward. But generally speaking, try not to short shift. There are times to do it. I don't personally think this is one of them. Nothing wrong with your line up here. Your deceleration here. Clark is a weird corner because it's uphill all the way. And as you tip in to the apex itself, it has a real steep uphill bit. That last little bit, you can be going potentially too fast there and get away with it. And the hill kind of acts like a berm and it kind of helps you into the corner, which means in this part of the track, you know, roughly where you're starting, you're slowing down, your line is there's no problem with your line into this corner. But from roughly speaking, where we're slowing down, where you're easing back the brakes is kind of more or less as you get to the final commitment of the tip into the corner. That's where you're easing back on the brakes. I think we can condense it down again. One thing I want you to try when you next go back there is get up to a comfortable pace. Don't try and brake later. What I would suggest to do with you when it comes to the braking is the transition has to be good. If you're going to compress it and going to brake much really hard, what you need to do is balance that weight, get the weight transfer progressively. If you go from basically loads of full gas to loads of big brakes, that weight transition acts as like a pendulum. It tips it forward, and then you're trying to control the thing. And of course, if the bike gets all out of shape, you can't brake as efficiently as you can if the bike was in shape. So the transfer of weight, the first part of it, as it were, this part is the most important part of your braking to get the bike from basically zero brakes to 100% braking. That happens in the first part of your braking. Now, once the brake's on, you can then potentially squeeze the shit out of it. So what I want you to try is where you would normally feel comfortable braking, roll off and squeeze, and then squeeze really hard. I mean, it'll effectively make you massively over brake. But what it'll start to do is it'll start to make you realize how fast you can kill speed. Because what I think you're doing, like a lot of people do, is they have a point on the track they feel comfortable with, and that's their braking point. So they start braking there, and then they fit in how much braking that they actually need. But they still refer to the same point, and they don't brake quite as hard. So you end up exaggerated. You end up almost rolling up to a corner because you've effectively broke too early. And again, it's about time we're spending on that line. If we can move that point with our braking point up sort of 20 yards, that means we're on throttle for 20 yards more, which means, of course, we've got to get rid of an extra bit of 20 yards of speed. So if you move your braking point up, you move actually 2 points. You move your speed up and the amount of time or distance that you've got to get rid of all of the speed plus the extra bit you've gained. So develop that confidence with being able to stop the bike by effectively getting into like an over braking situation, and then do it repeatedly, and it'll be completely wrong and you'll screw the entry up into the corner. But if you're going out there I wouldn't do it in a race. I would do it definitely in practice, on a practice day, so that the day isn't particularly wasted. And once you get that confidence about really being able to stop in the early part of your brakes, you can then control the release of the brake into the corner. And you can develop, I think of it like a shape. If you can imagine you're creating a shape for a jigsaw, if once you've got it the right shape, you just move it up to exactly where it fits and drop it in place. So if we can pick up your braking shape and move it 15, 20 yards up the track, that's got to help. But this kind of rolling off and sort of, you know, I wouldn't say half-hearted, but certainly not aggressive braking into a corner, has to kind of stop. The chicane, so going up into the hairpin is probably where the hardest most people brake, because it's a dead straight line approach. Apart from the bumps and the ripples, it's a straightforward approach. This is less straightforward because you've got much more of a tip in. Anything where the corner starts and runs in, you know, a more open sort of corner, your third and your fourth gear corners. As soon as the corner starts to open up, that means you're going to be trailing the brake longer, which means the last part of your release needs to be much more refined. Where if you're, say, getting to a hairpin, in a hairpin, you're basically braking almost to the apex, and then you dump the brakes and back on the throttle. So the section, or the amount of a corner where you roll, where you're easing the brake off and picking the throttle up in a hairpin is a much smaller, refined spot. And a corner like this, it's all about tapering it off into the corner. But basically, compressing your braking distance is what we're looking at here. Right, let's get on a bit. I'm busy yattering at it again. Right, into the corner. This particular lap, I think it was here. I made some notes somewhere. Where are we? 6:55. Yeah, I mentioned the short shifting into the corner. There is the odd time I listened on this lap is as we're running into this corner, before we get to the apex, is you actually pick up the throttle and then go off the throttle again. Now that tells me straight away the fact that you've gone for throttle and then you've eased off, which means you should have picked the throttle up, but done that closer into the corner, which means at this point in the track where we are now, where you initially touched the throttle, is we're not going fast enough. That makes sense, because we need to pick up that chunk of braking and bring the whole thing into the corner and drop it a bit closer here. So you pick the throttle up just as we're rolling in towards the apex, and then that transition of weight goes back onto the back wheel, and then you drive out of the corner up onto the straight. So again, it's a generalization, and every corner is slightly different. But the first time that you want to pick up the throttle generally is quite close to the apex. Clark is different because of the hill. Because of the hills killing the bike all the time, if you get a little bit slow going into the corner, you can afford to, well, you need to pick the throttle up now just to maintain some sort of pace around here, because the hill's killing the bike. So this is one corner where potentially you need to be on gas before you get to the apex. If it was downhill, it would be a completely different story altogether. Now, coming out of here is a proper high side scenario here, so I can't blame you being nice and progressive and smooth as the bike's sitting up. But you literally, by the time the bike gets to this point now, I can't tell where the RPM is at the moment, but you go to immediately one gear and immediately the second gear. So you short shift 2 gears and then accelerate in that second, in the, would it be fifth then? I don't know. But effectively you're going up 2 gears here and you hardly do any acceleration while that's happening. So you essentially travel from roughly where we are here to about, certainly beyond that end of the curve there, with virtually no acceleration. You're busy giving the bike gears. If you've got to this point, drive to that point while you're, do some acceleration and maybe then feed it a gear and then feed it another gear. Because the bike's going from right over to left, there's a certain amount of transition where the bike's going to be slowing around, and I've been here and it's a little bit humpy bumpy, etc. And it's all about trying to get drive onto the straight. But this is the section here where you tend to short shift every lap. And I personally think that's a negative. Make the bike drive in the gear it's in and feed a gear if required. That's my kind of take on that one. Because it's only till we're sort of almost, as it were, with the straight hip, the proper straight in view, before you really get seriously start to accelerate. And you're missing out. Your climb of acceleration is very protracted. And in fact, there was a guy in one of the other laps, we went through the corner and you spent probably 250 yards, 300 yards just getting with him. And then all of a sudden you kind of shot past him, and because that's where your bike was finally waking up. So we need to be accelerating as hard as we can, as early as we can. Right, run down into the hairpin. When you're catching somebody and you're not 100% certain of them, I can't blame you at all, kind of giving yourself the potential to sort of stay down here. So if they do something daft, as you've got plenty of room to get past them. But at this distance from this guy, it's extremely unlikely that, looking at how your speed, how you're catching him around the last few corners, that you're going to get past him before the hairpin. So I would suggest is we need to be making our way over towards that side of the track as opposed to staying here. Because effectively, the further over this side, the tighter the hairpin becomes. Hairpins aren't great places to try and go fast round anyway. But if the tighter you make them, you're not helping yourself at all. For instance, I would be looking at getting the bike much more over this side here. So the apex is probably 3/4 of the way up the hill there. So as we come down, it's a bit more like that, as opposed to we're doing this sort of thing into the corner. And it just allows you to, from where we're still on full brakes at this point, would be still full brakes at that point, tapering off. By the time we get to about there, it'd be 0 brakes. So it's like like that, where you'd be on full brakes here and then tapering it back to there. Where here, you'd put it on full brakes. It's like full brakes, nothing. Which means at this point in time, you've got rid of all your speed, really, and you're having to turn the corner. Your Suzuki, I'm not certain how, they're quite talky, 1000cc bike, but listening to the bike, you can hear the tone, particularly through the airbox, how low down the rev range the bike is when it comes out of this corner. And the bike probably spends, because what we're going to talk about now is getting out of the hairpin. You're obviously carrying a big angle of lean running around here. It drops up onto a plateau, and the amount of people who get that sort of whoop sort of moment here. So obviously start your acceleration, start to sit the bike up. But I would suggest potentially do that in a lower gear. You spend an awful long time driving up here before you get up into the next gear. And to me, that's time wasted, where the bike's coming from maybe, I don't know, it sounds like sort of 5,000 or 6,000 RPM. And you've got a huge amount of revs to get going to get the thing going. And I just feel you can be, at this point in time, maybe a gear lower. I would try and steer away from using first gear. I'm not sure what the gearing format of the bike is at all, but often the jump between first and second, or particularly on road boxes, is it's the biggest gap in the gearbox. So it's the biggest rev range drop you're going to get. And sometimes it can just push it over too far. So I would try and gear it up for second gear. And then because your second to third is a bit tighter, so you've got a less of a drop if there is a drop to be had. But I would certainly experiment on a lower gear here. And then the drive up the hill. Now, whether you've got to pass somebody or not, this is the best chance to make a 1000cc bike work for you. They're always going to wheelie. No matter what you do with them, you're going to spend your life trying to keep the front wheel on the floor. Now, you've ridden this enough times to know that the track is relatively flat until you get to the plateau bit. So that there's no big surprise that when you get to sort of around this point, the bike's going to start to go awkward on you. So it's from just where they start of the pit lane wall starts, as you know. Let's get there. From around this point is where, if there's any easing back to be done, it's now. But again, listen to your bike there. Several laps here, we're coming up the straight, and you come out in, I would suggest it maybe like third gear or high second gear around the hairpin. And the bike's whoa, and it's a slow build up, and then it eventually starts to get going. And when it's really just starting to get going, you feed it another gear, and then feed it another gear and another gear. And it's almost like you're trying to feed it gears to stop it wheeling. Now, I can understand that, but you're also feeding it the higher gear also dumbs down the bike's acceleration. The one thing when I was with the V&M team, Jack Valentine taught me about maximizing, because he was a drag race guy. He knew all about the time to change gears, and he was the person who taught me about keep it wound up and use the revs of the bike to really make the bike go there, particularly in the straight line. The bike's at an angle lean, it's a whole different story altogether. But the only time you really need to start easing off, realistically, is around this sort of area. From the end of the pit lane wall there, that's where we sort of ease back on the throttle, because you need the control element over the top. And as soon as you sort of get onto the plateau and coming off the other side, you can carry on developing the throttle even more. So there's a pause almost going over the rise. But up to this point, practice accelerating as hard as you can get away with. And it's amazing if you stop the short shifting and focus more on controlling what the bike's doing. It will help. It will help a lot. But the acceleration, you really be able to make a 1000cc bike work well for you. Well, I hope we've gone through that well enough, but we're just going to run around one more quick lap, and we're going to do it with sound. And I want you to listen to how because you do this particular lap, you do a fantastic job, particularly around Duffus, McIntyre, and into the chicane. I want you to listen to how smooth the throttle is. It's not the on and off the throttle. So let's have a listen at that. Now, for me, that was a much better lap than the first one. I would still like to see more ascent and descent of the revs, but the thing was the on and off the throttle thing had gone. It was much more, when you decide to put the throttle on, it was a positive throttle. It's amazing how much time you lose just by doing off throttle, on throttle. You do that 5 times a lap, the guy in front, you won't be able to see him anymore. It's amazing, because you've got, even if it's not acceleration, even if you've got a constant throttle, and then you shut the throttle, it's just like standing on the back brake for that split second, and then put the throttle back on. That the smoothness there was good. I just think we can be faster through the kink, and a bit more drive to a brake. Your braking is probably the biggest single area where you could probably improve on here, and The second one is stop short shifting. Experiment with it, and as much as you can, because what you sometimes do is and I'm guilty of it myself to a certain point, is you short shift and then go full gas, as opposed to the gear lower, carry on letting the bike accelerate and develop into full gas. The bike's going to try and wheelie, but you've got to control that. Now you can try a little dab with back brake to hold it down, but most of it will be done in the throttle control. And if you've got an electronic package on the bike, I'm not sure how good the Suzuki is do a little bit of work with the anti-wheelie and see how that works. I know with the BMW, it's very good. You can basically just pin it from the apex and let it sort itself out. A bit like your camera, you can dull it down too much with too much electronics. So it's finding that sweet spot from the electronics package. Anyway, I hope that's worked for you. Give us some feedback. Let us know your thoughts, and don't be shy about telling people about it. I'm hoping this sort of thing is going to work. I'm getting really positive feedback so far from it. But let me know what you think either way. All the best, Steve.